Welcome to God Talk. In Women in the Winds of Change, Part 1, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian women share their woman wisdom. They discuss varied images of God and sacred stories of women in the Bible and ancient traditions which can heal hearts, open minds, and challenge stereotypes. You will meet women from diverse backgrounds, including 3 Jerusalem women from 3 different religions and 3 different generations, who express their hopes for peace and justice in the Holy Land. The women in this program share their spiritual journeys, listen to one another, seek honest answers, and build bridges of understanding among different religions. These women are models of faith, openness, and compassion who can inspire and encourage us. Let us meet them now.
The Judeo-Christian tradition is imaged many different ways in the Bible. God is like a light, God is like a rock, God is like a fire, God is like a father, God is like a mother, God is like a helper. Our images of God shape us. At the same time, we as people shape again and again our images of the divine, who is above and beyond any one image that we have.
We call you mighty God, Father eternal, leader of armies, King of kings, Lord of lords. But you are washerwoman God. We know you in the waters, washerwoman God, splashing, laughing free. If you didn't clean the mess, where would we be? Scrubbing, working, sweating God, cleansing you and me. Make our hearts as white as snow, wash us through and through. Washerwoman, let us be like you.
Theologian Elizabeth Schussler-Ferenza says that Mary has kept the feminine face of God alive in the tradition throughout the ages, in the Christian tradition, and I'm a great advocate of that. I've written several books on the topic of feminine imagery of God, and I believe that Mary has done that. She's played that powerful role because I think people realized that they needed a motherly image, and God seemed so far away for centuries of Christians, and Jesus somehow became that stern judge, I think, throughout some of our Christian history, and Mary was the accessible one, the one that everybody could come to, and yet God, of course, is all loving and all good, and all these human images are personified to infinite perfection in our God, and we who are made in the image and likeness of God, you know, are made in the image of the divinity, and truly our humanity reflects God's beauty and God's femininity, we could say masculinity, but God is beyond all of that. Do you agree with that, or do you think there's been a renewal in understanding that, or what do you think about that whole concept of Mary and the feminine images of God, or the feminine face of God?
I think that we're at an early stage of realizing how Mary may indeed have been taking the place of a feminine or a female God, at least in the Christian tradition, because of the overwhelming masculinity of theology in Christianity, with Father and Son naturally masculine, and Spirit sort of by default, even though the Spirit doesn't really have a gender per se the way Father and Son do when we use that language. Nevertheless, it seems as though Mary has sort of slipped in to replace that. And from one point of view, I think you can say that it has benefits because people have found her an accessible way to go to God. But from another point of view, it tends to shift her into someone she isn't. She isn't God. No teaching has ever claimed that. In fact, have been very careful not to. And so I think we're in the early stages of now of trying to give to Mary what is Mary's, her special humanity as a woman close to God, but a real human being, and give to God what is God's, that God can be imaged either as male or female. But we're a long way from really fully getting there.
And Mary was speaking of Western Christianity. Now, Eastern Christianity has always held the feminine of the Holy Spirit, that is the feminine expression of God's own self. And I find very interesting when Moses asks for another name of God, because Yahweh is so distant and philosophical, I am who I am, that God puts Moses in the cleft of the rock and says, I'll pass before you and you can see my back and I'll give you a new name. And the new name is Raham or Raham. And it's a play on words because the Hebrew Bible doesn't put the vowels in. And so the R, the H, and the M can be either womb or compassion. And I think what we're learning there in God's new name in Exodus 36 is that God has a womb compassion. A mother can't forget her child. And so I think that feminine aspect of God has been with us right since Moses ever asked for the names of God.
How about Islam, Nicole? Could you address any of that?
Well, the word Allah is a wonderful word because it has no plural and it has no gender. So it's very much encompassing what our Creator is, which is beyond all bounds. But what you're referring to, we also have a word in Arabic which is one of the names of Allah. We have 99 names, and it's Ar-Rahman, which means the one who's most merciful, most beneficent, who both gives us our tests and helps us. And that word also in Arabic includes the concept of womb, as you're mentioning too, coming from the same root. And so Allah is everything and encompasses all things. So it's a wonderful way to explain that.
So the feminine is encompassed.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I was going to actually share a couple of very interesting insights from Jewish tradition on this whole situation. I think that the rabbis of a later age who looked back on this biblical text felt incredibly uncomfortable with it because the naked reading of the text can lead you to no other conclusion than that Hagar was treated with tremendous injustice. And how indeed how can we justify this kind of behavior? This is supposed to be all done with this was supposed to be part of God's will. So what they do is they create all kinds of elaborate subtexts in order to explain, to justify essentially what happened. One of the more beautiful subtexts is that Abraham's heart was broken because he loved his love for Ishmael was so very strong, and that of all the 10 trials that Abraham underwent, including what's normally seen as the ultimate trial, which is the binding of his son and almost sacrifice of his son Isaac, in fact, the banishment of Ishmael was the one that was the hardest on him. This is Jewish midrash, by the way. Another midrash, there's a very strong midrashic tradition then that goes and examines what did Hagar do to merit this treatment. And it makes up a very elaborate story, how once Hagar became pregnant, she looks down on Sarah and she says, well, Sarah must not be everything that she makes herself out to be. You know, she pretends to be a righteous person, but inside she must have done something very wrong because God is punishing her with barrenness, and look, at the instant I sleep with Abraham, boom, I get pregnant. So she's lording it over Sarah. And then when Ishmael is born, the Torah text is very oblique. It simply says they were playing. He was laughing, basically, is what it says. He was sporting with Isaac. What does that mean? The rabbis needed to interpret it. Well, one of the things that he was doing is he was saying, ha, 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 I'm going to get double the inheritance. You get nothing, you know. And another midrash says Ishmael was shooting arrows at Isaac and purposely just barely missing him and then making a joke of it and said, oh, I was only teasing after all. And that was the point at which Sarah just snaps and she says, that's it. I'm not going to put up with this kind of thing. She felt that Ishmael was endangering her son, and also she had been told by God that her son was the one to inherit and to carry on the covenant. And there's one other thing also which is used as kind of the way to really nail, you know, Ishmael and say, well, he definitely deserved to be kicked out, and that was a midrash that has Ishmael building altars and sacrificing to idols, which of course is the worst kind of that's anathema. You couldn't do anything worse than that from the point of view of the Torah. So, once Sarah sees this, she says, oh, he's a horrible influence on my son. My son's going to see this. He's going to start to sacrifice to idols as well. I've got to get this bad influence out of my son's life. So basically, the rabbis need to find some kind of justification because they are truly horrified at the treatment of this woman and her son. But once they invent all of these stories, they're able to justify and say, well, they really deserved it, and this is why.
Our understanding is a little different again in that, well, first of all, these are all people who, these are mothers of lineages of prophets. And so we need to look at them with a different eye, I think. Our understanding is that, yes, the natural feelings of any human emerged in Sarah. So jealousy did emerge. And in her effort not to act on that, according to understanding, she asked Abraham to take Hajar away and with her son, so that their removal would benefit her in her, so she didn't act out any negativity or any negative intentions to these people, and so that she could maintain her purity. And in general, we look a little bit beyond these figures, and we look at what they symbolize and what they're moving and the way they really follow the will of God, what that actually has produced for us. And in each of them moving, and the whole fact that Hajar actually moved to the desert is the whole beginning of part of our Hajj ritual, again, referring back to the saffron and marwa and the water emerging and so forth. And what that whole move is even more significant than the interplay between these two individuals for us. Because what that water emerging from that barren place itself, too, signifies to us is that it allows that place, which is Mecca, to then be a self-sustaining place where people then could go for pilgrimage. And that place itself could support life now. And so therefore the pilgrimage there would be easier for people. And so this was like a symbol for all of mankind from that point on, that we could all go to that place now. And so the significance then broadens for us.
What role do you think patriarchy played in the story?
There's no biblical story without patriarchy. It's just endemic to the whole thing. But it's got to be. I mean, I think the lineage and patrimony and the carrying on of the lineage is absolutely essential here. But it's interesting because I don't think that patriarchy is the most important thing in this story. I don't think that's what the story is really about. I think it's only the cultural background to it all.
In my view, the story in the Bible, the story offers a somewhat subtle critique of patriarchy because on at least two occasions, God tells Abraham to do what his wife tells him to do, or to submit to her. And so, in my view, it's exactly it's a very precise refutation of even in the New Testament, you have a reference to Sarah obeying Abraham and calling him Lord. But what you see in the text is Abraham obeying Sarah.
Right.
And when he doesn't know what to do, and he's looking for guidance, and God says, "Well, do what she says." And so, there's patriarchy out the window.
Power depends on your context, but then sometimes the context draws the power out of you. And in Deborah, she had clear public power. And so she starts from that position, which I think is very unusual in any of the scriptures. But Judith is very different. She's portrayed first as not a poor, but a widow, who is sort of supposed to be the most powerless person, except she's a rich widow. Yes. But she bursts on the scene in the second half of that story, and she moves into the public as a public leader of the people from being in a very private fasting and sackcloth and ashes and praying position. And so the context of the threat to the nation led her from the private domain into the public domain, where then she exercised that kind of public power.
Although what I found really amazing about the story, and I actually had never read the story until for this program, because it's not in the Hebrew scriptures, and I just found it amazing that they comment that she, first of all, they just accept her authority.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem like it's something new. It's not like they're surprised, like where did this come from? And they in fact say in there's a line that from birth she's been very wise, which is a very early age. And so it's surprising that it seems to be, with both Deborah and Judith, a perfectly acceptable thing. They don't remark on it as being astounding, that here's this woman who is wise and who people come to for counsel and they respect, and she's able to call, both of them are able to, Deborah is able to just call up Barak and say, here's what you need to do, and he does it, no questions asked. And Judith is able to call the elders of the town and say, here's my plan, and they say, okay. There does seem, it's surprising how much I wouldn't have expected in ancient times for a woman to have such an independent role and to be already accepted as an authority.
I remember the moment a number of years ago when it occurred to me that there was something wrong in all those pictures of the Last Supper, with only the male disciples and Jesus gathered around the table. And I thought, where did they get the food from?
Who's cooking?
They sent out to Passover Delight or something. And some little guy showed up at the door and they gave him 4 shekels and he drove away on his bicycle or his camel or something. That until we start to see the women in the pictures again, until we get used to that combination of Eleanor and Franklin and Rosalind and Jimmy and Hillary and Bill, and we begin to populate our mental peoplescape with women again, nobody's going to move forward.
Right. And I think it brings out, too, the partnership of men and women, and in sharing power and in having an influence on changing policy. I think that's very much.
Esther, of course, had an influence, but again, going back to the fact that it is like a real folklore tale or a carnival tale, because the men are just, idiots.
Yes.
I mean, it's the idiot king.
Let's have a drinking party.
The idiot king and the queen, who's so good, and will save the people. So it isn't much to say that she had influence over him, because he and Haman, they were all sort of, one-dimensional and almost comedic characters, but still she needed even these very weak and comedic men. She still needed them to achieve her ends. That's where Miriam is different, if I can jump back to Miriam. But I mean, the fact that she was as important, and she's come down to us, and she is linked to no man other than, as I say, once mentioned as Aaron's sister, and we assume she was Moses' sister, but she's actually the only woman who's mentioned in the genealogy of the Torah who is not linked to a husband or father. The only one, which is kind of a sad commentary to think she's the only one, but at least she's the only one, and therefore she had to really be a person in her own right. And you get someone like Deborah also, who wasn't linked particularly to a husband. Whereas you get the characters like Esther that are more typical. Even if she was strong, she still needed a man to work through to achieve her ends.
And that's why I like Vashti so much, because she refused to be that sex object. And today we're examining as a society, I think, the roles of sexuality and gender and power, the relationship between that. I think that's a real important question. And I think women are struggling with today. The media certainly portrays women a certain way.
Complete reconciliation cannot be granted, cannot be accomplished unless, politically speaking, both parties gain their rights and their expectations. So it's the two processes go together, hand in hand, the political and the reconciliation. If you gain more, if you can provide more to the people, meet up your expectations, you will help them and assist them in the process of reconciliation.
Do you have a special perspective as women?
Well, I identify myself as a woman, as a mother, as a peace seeker. I don't know if there is another perspective than being a woman and a mother in our area between me and other mothers. Well, we are all very worried about our children, and we all want better future for them. So I think like any other woman. Well, I would like to think that there is no difference between men and women when they're thinking about peace. Because, you know, men has been through wars and they know what wars caused by. Unfortunately, there is a difference, and I always say it, and I'm going to say it again, that give the peace process to women and it's going to be easily to achieve the peace. So unfortunately, men are not thinking like us, and men are in rule now more than us.
Well, as a woman, I'm married, I have family, I have children, so I know what role I played. I raised 3 children, and this is a difficult task, but I did this besides doing my career as a teacher, and I think I've raised a good family. But to talk about a more general perspective, I belong to a generation that as women we were at the receiving end to deal with the suffering that results from what you said, the tension and the violence. So we played a great role through organizations, through charitable societies, through volunteer work to address the needs of our people, being children, women, widowed mothers, bereaved families. All of this was a big burden. You can see different roles, not different perspectives, that men, well, in our part of the world, men are more the breadwinners, so they are the ones away from home, from the family. So the women are more anchored in this homemaking. It doesn't mean they don't work, but they really have a stronger responsibility. And this perspective about raising the family and keeping the family and protecting the family is shared between the husband and the wife, but the main burden really falls on the mother, as it is maybe all over the world, and we cherish the family very much. When you talk about the peace process and who's deciding, who's in the decision-making position and so on, it's predominantly the leadership is men. Although we had in Palestine, we have quite a number of prominent women who participated in the peace process. To start with, women took part in the Intifada, in the uprising. They were participants, not at the receiving end. They were at the receiving end when the husband is killed, when the son is killed, when the husband is arrested. But we had women who were who lost their lives. We had women who spent years in prison. So when it comes to peacemaking, I think we have the same perspective.
In Women in the Winds of Change, Part 2, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian women discuss their experiences of a new feminist spiritual awakening that is occurring around the globe. In these conversations, they affirm equality, inclusivity, and partnership. They share their experiences of the sacred with us. They remind us of our kinship with creation in our earth community and challenge us to work for justice for the marginalized and excluded people. I invite you to reflect on the transforming vision these wise women offer us at the dawning of the 21st century.
us make people in our own image. And so, God created people in the image of herself. She created them female. In the image of God, she created them male. God blessed them, saying to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and steward it with care. Take good care of the fish of the sea, the birds of heaven, and all living animals on the earth. See, I give you all the seed-bearing plants, the trees, the fruit." And so it was. God saw all that had been made, and God said, "This is very, very good." Evening came, and morning came, the sixth day.
The interesting thing about it is that there are two stories of the creation of the human being, of Adam, and then later of Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. And in the first story in Genesis, in the first chapter of Genesis, it says that quote that you have, that God created Adam, and we have to be careful to call it Adam rather than man, even though the name Adam has been translated as man. In the image of God, male and female created them. The real problem with how women became subjugated is in the next story, is in the second creation story, where Eve was created from Adam. And by focusing on this story, we could see that equality was originally intended. What's interesting is there's a lot of pagan religions that had this androgynous first being created, and that the rabbinic scholars often thought of from this story that maybe the first prototype, human prototype, was an androgynous being.
Sort of like the earth creature?
Yeah, well, the front, some even went as far as to say as the front of what, the front and the back, one was male, one was female, in opposites. I think looking at what made us unequal, is sanctified by religion, is in the other story, in the second chapter of Genesis, because Selah, the word that's commonly translated as rib, really means side. And so if Eve was created from one of Adam's sides, it meant that Eve was created to be an opposite. And if we look at it as a balance, because you need opposites as a balance, then that story retranslated can also give proof that we were meant to be equals as partners.
I think that's very interesting.
So, as we say all the time, it's up to who's interpreting, but it hasn't been interpreted correctly all these years, to tell you the truth.
And also the stories were told at different times for different purposes. And I think we lose sight of the fact that the biblical record is a story written down after a long oral tradition from various streams of the tradition that then landed in one book. And so taking those streams apart, as the Rabbi has done, helps us to understand them much more deeply and completely. And we can, I don't think, ever lose sight of the cultural context, the kind of reaction to the pagan cultures of the time.
I think something that you hit upon as far as women's empowerment, I think something that I guess a lot of non-Muslims are not aware of and a lot of Muslim women don't take advantage of is the fact that, in my opinion, true women's empowerment came to Muslims 1,400 years ago, because in the Quran, for instance, as far as women's rights go, as far as divorce, as far as voting, owning property, being able to work, and all that kind of stuff, were given to Muslim women 1,400 years ago. Whereas, a lot of people in the West are like, we're very civilized, we empower women, all that kind of stuff. But if you look at the facts, as far as the United States goes, in 1929, the 19th Amendment, giving women suffrage. 1929 is not that long ago.
Right.
And it's very interesting to see how people have really made it an issue that, Muslim women's empowerment, they don't even see it. They're not aware of it. Or even as far as divorce rights go, Muslim women are allowed to not only get a divorce, they can ask for a divorce. Or like owning property. A Muslim woman is allowed to own property, or when she works, she does not have to give any part of that money to the husband. Do you know what I'm saying? It is her own personal thing. Now, of course, if it is, for the betterment of the family, of course she's not going to be, evil and not share. But those are the rights that were given to Muslim women. And
where was that? I would be
it's in the Quran. All of that, all of that is in the Quran, which is our holy book. And it's very interesting for me to hear different kinds of feminist groups and just women's groups in general, all this hype and gripe about equality and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, Islam says women are equal to men. They're different. They have different roles. Not to say that, different means something less or something more, but they have different roles to play. And it's I think it would be interesting for any feminist group to really look at these principles and be like, well, hey, this is kind of what we're fighting for.
So much needs to change. The rituals we don't have rituals for divorce. We don't have rituals for a girl's first menstruation. We did have rituals for house blessings. Those need to be brought back. We don't have ceremonies, croning ceremonies, for instance, to bless women for their wisdom. That's women who are 56 years and older. We don't have menopause ceremonies. We don't have reproductive choice rituals. We don't have the life cycle of women rituals. We don't have transition rituals. We don't have healing from domestic violence, abuse, incest, rape. There are so many ceremonies that need to be created, and the structure is not at the moment able to expand to be that inclusive. So many of us are saying, how do we fit in the structure, and how do we keep expanding those doors so that, in fact, the tradition of our grandmothers is our tradition as well.
What a challenge. And Marjorie, from the Protestant or non-Catholic, non-Muslim perspective, from another voice.
Well, I'd like to touch on two things. You raised the Quran as really the basis for the empowerment of women. Absolutely. And I often say to people, we are now returning to the inclusiveness that Jesus invited to the table. I think that, at least in my tradition, we're doing battle with what the church has accreted over the generations, but the inclusiveness and welcome that Jesus made to women, I think is part of my interest in the biblical stories, in reclaiming those stories of women. And I'd also like to say, in my little church community, just last Sunday we had a wonderful service, a sermon by a woman who had created a quilt to celebrate a miscarriage that she had last fall, tied it in with the scripture, the story of the fig tree, as an unfinished story. She said, we often think about the complete big story, but we need to remember that there are little stories in it. And then used her own experience as part of that. It was a wonderful worship.
We had a service at the Washington Cathedral 2 weeks ago to celebrate Reformation Sunday with our Lutheran brothers and sisters. And Bishop Theodore Snyder, who is the Lutheran bishop in this metropolitan area, was there with Bishop Haynes and with me. They're both the diocesan bishops. I'm suffragan, assistant bishop. But I was just before them as we were processing out. And as we got to the end of the procession, the Bishop Haynes, who's the diocesan bishop, stopped me and he said, were you aware of what was happening, particularly to women and younger women, as you came down the aisle? He said, I've seen it before, but today, he said, it was marked. He said the light that came into the faces, particularly the eyes of women, some men and younger women, as you came down as a bishop of the church. He said it was really rather extraordinary.
Oh, that's so exciting. Andrea, as one has worked for this for so many years.
I feel very, very strongly that there is something missing in the ministry of our church because women are not ordained. I think that because the teaching that is part of the priestly ministry, the teaching and the preaching, it's a living thing, and it has to be whole. There has to be, we have to have the entire spectrum of thinking and feeling involved in how we hand on the message of the gospel and how we teach the living out of the gospel. Women are needed.
This grew, actually it was inspired by a project that was done by the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, who represent over 94% of U.S. nuns. And they did actually it was a 4-year study called the Benchmarks Project that was geared to discovering, well, what are women's roles in the Catholic Church right now, and what are some things we can do right now to advance women's roles. And they came up with 15 recommendations that were published in a book in 1996. And foremost among the recommendations, I would say there were many, but there were several that I thought were most salient, one of them being education about women in church history, women in scripture, Jesus and women. The other one being what can we do right now to advance women's roles in the church short of ordination, given the fact that things don't look like they're going to change too soon right now in the Vatican. We don't even have to talk about ordination. We have dueling church teachings, if you will. We have John Paul II in 1995 in his letter for women calling for women's equality in the church. We have the U.S. bishops in their benchmark study calling for women's equality in the church. So this project is going to try to hold our church leadership's feet to the fire and say, okay, we want women's equality. This is what we need to do to get equality. So I think the project has many tools that grassroots, parish-based people can do to advance women's roles in the church right now short of ordination.
I guess this was back in 1970. And I was working as a young nun in the rural area of South Carolina in the Sea Islands. And I was working on, I don't know, a housing project, and I was working with women who were doing some crafts and sewing and so forth. But there was an older black minister with this church around which the community was centered. And I used to visit him and his wife. They were sort of my grandparents' age, and they were wonderful folks. And mostly we chatted about the weather, about crops or crabs or something like that. But one day he talked about racism, and he got very, very serious. And I'll never forget this. He started to cry. And he said to me, the really awful thing is when you believe what they say about you.
Yes, exactly.
And I went, oh my God. And of course, he was of a generation when he undoubtedly took it in.
Yeah.
And believed it, and he believed about himself what was being said. And I never realized until that moment how devastating that can be interiorly to somebody.
It can be. Exactly.
Right.
And I think that continues to this day, again, going back to the inner city, to young blacks and Latinas, who on TV or in movies see themselves portrayed simply as gang members or as very sexually promiscuous people. And there are very few good examples of ordinary blacks doing ordinary things, because of course that doesn't make the news, that doesn't make for a popular show. And that's not to say that that isn't the quality of other situation comedies as well. But when you're constantly bombarded with this this type of thinking, you do begin to buy into it. And I've heard from, in my lectures and when I travel, visit churches and things, from young people who will say to me, well, why should I bother getting an education? That's just for white people, that's, that has nothing to do with us. Or I'm not going to live long enough for it to be of any value, so why should I even bother? I'm going to be killed, or I'm going to die of a drug overdose or something like that. And it just, for me, it just squeezes my heart, because I'm looking at someone who's obviously very talented, very intelligent, who could do well, but who probably from kindergarten on has been told that he or she is not capable of achieving, and has been routed into what they call the special education classes, where a disproportionate number of Latinas, and black males especially are found, rather than in the general mainstream, or of course in the honors courses.
Right.
And that sends devastating messages.
These are issues that can certainly be discussed in houses of worship.
Definitely.
It's a very appropriate place to talk about them. And also people can't sit back and let their politicians pass laws that are bad. They have to let them know they don't agree.
Exactly.
That's right, yeah.
You know, joining coalitions.
Yes.
To work on stopping the death penalty and justice issues for education. You know,
and I think especially if these coalitions are ecumenical. In other words, it's not just the Catholic Church speaking, it's not just the Jewish synagogue speaking, but it's all people of good faith, all people of goodwill, who are trying to do something for the common good of all humanity.
I'd like to tell you my memory of the moment that I became an ecofeminist, first saying that the word itself, of course, comes from the word ecology, someone concerned about the earth, ecology, and feminist, obviously. I remember sitting in Washington, D.C. in a congressional hearing room that was about the water systems of the earth. I was already a feminist and had internalized that idea that what feminism is about is the oppression by some groups of others who think they're superior and think they can manage or control the lower group, in the case of feminism, men and women. As I sat in that congressional hearing room that day and listened to the largely men on the committee talking about the water, I realized they had exactly the same attitude toward the water. That is, it was something to manage. It was something that tended to get disorderly. It was something that tended to get out of control, and it needed to be managed. And in some kind of split second, I thought, oh, the water and women were all the same, you know, and the same kind of attitude is being projected out to both of us. Let's get us in control and managed and in order. And I became an ecofeminist.
Well, I've always loved trees. I loved trees when I was a little girl. When I was out playing, I would climb a particular tree in our park and climb up to the top and be all by myself and chant Latin things to myself. So I guess I was sort of a nature mystic. And then from loving trees, I proceeded to work on them scientifically and go to school for many years to learn the science language, which is also a language of love. It's a dialogue between you and the trees and what's going on. And the tools that we use are tools of love. Theologians, for example, do not love God because they spend time thinking and studying God. In the same way, science is a way of loving the earth. And so that's what my vocation is to help, by using science and technology, help people to harmonize their needs with that of the earth community.
So feminism was all about women's empowerment and claiming our truth and our identity, and yet we have been, trained that you need to go inward to find the presence of God. So that, I think that you named that. Would you just share a little bit about, your experience of that, and as one of the tension points between spirituality and feminism, and what we can do about it, or how do we reconcile it?
Well, the part of the book you're talking about is something my editor and I ended up calling the four thingies. There's four specific areas where feminism and a meditative spiritual path seem to come into conflict. And the very first one has to do with that that tension between the feeling that when you're following a meditative practice, a path, you gravitate very naturally towards silence, and you're trying to impose a silence within as well. And that whole tradition is grounded in ancient monastic traditions as well. But what you realize when you think about it a while is that all of these practices, you know, keeping silence, opposing ego, seeking enclosure, going against desire, all of these were very naturally developed when it was men coming into a monastic situation, because those mandates go against privileges that men enjoyed to a reasonable extent in the culture. But women have never, you know, had the privilege of being able to say what they felt like saying in the first place. Women have been enclosed for all kinds of reasons, having to do again with class and even safety. Women have not been free to pursue their desires, and women have very rarely been encouraged to develop a sturdy sense of self. So what worked and made sense in those old traditions for men isn't necessarily adapted for women, not just modern women, but women of any time. So that set me to thinking, gee, I have to take all of this really into account if I'm going to even ground my spiritual practice on a real authentic foundation.
Absolutely. Well, how do you do it then?
How do you do it?
How do feminists do it in your experience? Do you think of other ways of finding one's voice and claiming one's spirituality in a way where you bring these two together in harmony?
Well, it's such a rich question. You know, the first book I wrote, Enduring Grace, which was about the women mystics of the West, was, I think, my preparation for this, because in the process of writing about women like, well, of researching, you know, before to write about women like Teresa of Avila and Clare of Assisi and the Catherines and so on, what I discovered was this paradoxical truth that the most outspoken, courageous, vivid women in Western history came out of cloisters for the most part. You know, we're part of this very intensely patriarchal, hierarchical tradition. So I'd already dealt with that paradox even in writing that book, and discovered that, in fact, there's a direct connection between becoming very, very quiet and finding your true voice. I guess what I really did was I realized after a while that I've been saying, you know, finding voice versus silence. Enclosure versus freedom. And suddenly I realized, well, let's just erase the versus and realize that that idea that things are necessarily opposed to one another, that's that dualistic either-or thinking that's associated with patriarchy.
Exactly.
And so instead of that, I just started putting both and, that in order to have a real voice, you need deep silence. You know, in order to really understand freedom, you need to have, and use it well, you need to have that experience of the kind of enclosure that allows you a safe place, where you can put down your defenses and your very definitions of yourself for the time being. It's like taking off a suit of clothes that doesn't fit in order to find your way to something that does fit.
Well, you know, we talk about this a lot, that this is an embodied spirituality. It's an everyday spirituality. And you just can look out into the audience and see women's faces light up when you say that. You know, and I mean, in our book, we have suggestions for different kinds of topics to use for meetings. And we talk about things like menstruation and menopause and body image, you know, and how we can, you know, deal with those important parts of our lives in ways that are meaningful. So
and seeing the sacred aspects of those, of giving birth, for instance, or seeing the sacred aspects of our cycle and how, you know, biologically we're attuned to be more reflective during certain parts and more outward during certain parts, and that just closing that body-mind split that that couple thousand years has so embedded in us, and helping us to see our bodies as sacred temples, and then how do we treat ourselves very, very differently than if we think they're a decoration.
Tell us about the different kinds of circles, you know, that you've met as you traveled around, or that you are aware of, that are around the country, the different kinds of groupings that are happening.
Well, when we started doing our research for this, and by the way, we are not academics, we're not scholars. It's very kind of intuitive. research, you know, we would say, we're interested in talking to women about spirituality groups, and the next thing you know, a friend would be calling and say, well, you know, I have a Jewish friend who's in a New Moon Rosh Chodesh group, and lo and behold, we discovered that there's a whole movement of Jewish women's groups called Rosh Chodesh, which means the new moon. And that's been I think that's probably been within the last 10 years that started. We found women's groups that, we found and we profiled this group in our book, a Mormon women dance group.
Oh,
can you imagine?
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah. What they did was dance together. They'd come together and create choreographed pieces that reflected where a woman was with a particular spiritual issue that was on her mind or on her heart, and all the company would, you know, be parts of that, but she would choreograph it, and it would be a work of her heart.
And they hardly ever talked. We couldn't imagine that, because we love to talk in our group, but they just don't talk. There are, you know, book groups, writing groups, all sorts of expressive groups.
Dream groups.
Wow.
Prayer groups, healing groups.
Do they belong to organized religions? Sounds like they're a mixture of...
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very much a mixture. There's many women who... We had a whole van of women come to one of our workshops where they had come from an Episcopal church, and they were totally involved in their church, and they wanted to bring women's circles to their church. So that's one end of the spectrum, and another end of the spectrum would be a woman who long ago left organized religion, couldn't go for it in any way, shape, or form, and now sees this as a way to not have to have a practice that's totally alone. I mean, we both had spiritual practices and journeys that were, we shared with individual friends, but until we had this idea, the idea of having a community, a really intimate community, it didn't seem possible. So there's inside, outside, and mixtures.
I hope you've enjoyed this God Talk special on the passionate search of women for spirituality, equality, and justice in our Earth community. Take good care, and God bless you.